Some royal lives were not just lived and forgotten, they were deliberately rewritten, their most intimate truths buried beneath layers of state-sanctioned fiction. When a prince's natural desires threatened the foundation of absolute power, entire networks of surveillance, control, and historical revision awakened to contain the damage. But what happens when the human cost of that erasure finally surfaces? This was not a prince who married for love. This was a man whose future was stolen from him the moment his brother realized that Philippe's heart belonged to other men, and that this truth could destroy the divine authority of the French crown forever. On March 31st, 1661, Prince Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, was forced to consummate a marriage he had resisted for months. Court records from Versailles reveal that Philippe had openly maintained relationships with male favorites, particularly his documented attachment to the Chevalier de Lorraine. But as Louis XIV's younger brother and original heir to the throne, Philippe's personal desires had become a matter of state security that demanded immediate, brutal intervention. The wedding night was not a celebration. It was the first systematic destruction of Philippe's autonomy. Preserved diplomatic correspondence shows that European courts had been watching Philippe's unnatural inclinations for years, creating a scandal that threatened French prestige across Catholic Europe. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. Contemporary accounts document Philippe's emotional resistance to the marriage arrangement. Saint-Simon's memoirs record that Philippe had been observed in tender moments with young courtiers, behavior that Louis XIV's spies reported directly to the king through encrypted palace communications. The Versailles surveillance network had been tracking Philippe's movements, monitoring his private apartments, and documenting his relationships for months before the forced marriage was announced. Archival letters suggest that Henrietta of England, Philippe's bride, had been briefed about her husband's condition before arriving in France. Her private correspondence with her brother King Charles II reveals her awareness that this marriage was designed not for romance, but for reproductive duty and public scandal containment. The wedding ceremony itself became a performance of heteronormative royal theatre, designed to publicly erase Philippe's documented same-sex desires. Palace records show that Louis XIV personally orchestrated every detail, from the guest list to the ceremonial timing, ensuring maximum visibility for Philippe's correction and return to acceptable royal behavior. But the surveillance network that had arranged this forced marriage was not satisfied with a single public performance. Court documentation reveals that Philippe's private life would be monitored, controlled, and systematically dismantled for the rest of his natural life. What happened next would prove that royal marriage was only the beginning of Philippe's institutional persecution. Philippe was born to rule France. Until September 1st, 1661, he stood as the direct heir to Louis XIV's throne, a position that transformed his private desires into matters of international diplomacy and dynastic survival. Court memoranda reveal that Philippe's documented relationships with men were not simply personal scandals, but potential constitutional crises that could destabilize the entire Bourbon monarchy. Archived correspondence from the Spanish ambassador to Versailles documents the foreign surveillance of Philippe's irregular attachments. Catholic European courts were monitoring every aspect of Philippe's behavior, searching for weaknesses that could be exploited against French power. When Philippe was observed in intimate conversations with young male courtiers, these reports traveled directly to Madrid, Vienna, and Rome through encrypted diplomatic channels. The birth of Louis XIV's son, the Grand Dauphin, in 1661 officially removed Philippe from direct succession. But palace records show that this change only intensified the institutional pressure on Philippe's sexuality. As the king's brother, Philippe remained a visible symbol of Bourbon dignity, and his documented same-sex relationships continued to create diplomatic vulnerabilities that foreign enemies could weaponize against France. Saint-Simon's private journals record that Philippe's effeminate mannerisms and his preference for male companionship had become subjects of international gossip networks. Preserved letters between European royal houses reveal that Philippe's sexuality was being discussed in courts from London to Naples, with some diplomatic correspondence suggesting that his unnatural inclinations proved French royal bloodline weakness. The Versailles intelligence network, under Louis XIV's direct command, had begun systematic documentation of Philippe's private activities. Court surveillance records show that spies were placed in Philippe's household staff. His personal apartments were searched regularly, and his correspondence was intercepted and copied before delivery. This was not casual royal gossip. This was state-sponsored monitoring designed to control a potential threat to French dynastic legitimacy. Archival evidence suggests that Philippe was initially unaware of the extent of this surveillance campaign. Contemporary accounts describe him as naive about the political implications of his romantic attachments, continuing to maintain close relationships with male favorites, even as the royal intelligence apparatus documented every conversation, every private moment, every expression of forbidden desire. The institutional response escalated when foreign courts began using Philippe's sexuality as ammunition in diplomatic negotiations. Preserved correspondence from the papal nuncio reveals that Rome had formally expressed concerns about Philippe's influence on Catholic royal dignity, creating pressure for Louis XIV to demonstrate decisive action against his brother's corruption. But the surveillance network was preparing for far more than diplomatic containment. Palace records indicate that Louis XIV's advisors were developing comprehensive strategies to permanently neutralize Philippe's capacity for scandal. Strategies that would soon destroy every relationship Philippe valued and transform him into a closely monitored prisoner within his own royal household. The king's patience with his brother's weaknesses was approaching a dangerous end. The palace that Louis XIV built to display royal magnificence had also become the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in European history, and Philippe's private apartments were its primary target. Preserved administrative records reveal that by 1663, an entire network of informants, servants, and court officials had been systematically placed throughout Philippe's household with the singular mission of documenting his inappropriate relationships. Court employment registers show that Philippe's personal staff had been carefully selected for loyalty to the king rather than to Philippe himself. His valets, pages, and even his confessor reported directly to Louis XIV's intelligence coordinators through encrypted daily summaries. Saint-Simon's memoirs describe a household where Philippe could not speak privately, could not receive visitors without documentation, and could not maintain any relationship without immediate royal knowledge. The architectural surveillance was equally systematic. Palace construction records indicate that Philippe's apartments at Versailles were designed with hidden observation alcoves and concealed passageways that allowed royal spies to monitor his private conversations. When Philippe moved to the Palais Royal in Paris, court engineering documents show that similar surveillance modifications were installed under the pretext of security improvements. Archival correspondence from the controller of royal households reveals the operational details of this monitoring campaign. Philippe's mail was intercepted at multiple points. Incoming letters were steamed open, copied, resealed, and delivered hours late. Outgoing correspondence was similarly documented, with copies sent directly to Louis XIV's private secretary before the originals reached their intended recipients. The surveillance extended to social control through strategic isolation. Court attendance records show that known male favorites of Philippe were systematically excluded from royal functions, denied court positions, or reassigned to distant provinces. When Philippe attempted to maintain relationships despite these barriers, detailed reports documented every meeting, every gift exchange, every expression of affection that violated acceptable royal behavior. Financial surveillance completed the containment strategy. Treasury records reveal that Philippe's personal expenditures were monitored and controlled, preventing him from maintaining independent households for potential lovers or providing financial support that might encourage loyalty from male companions. Every purchase, every gift, every financial transaction required approval from royal comptrollers who reported directly to the king. The The psychological impact was documented by contemporary observers. Madame de Montespan's private letters described Philippe as increasingly anxious, paranoid about court conversations, and emotionally isolated from the relationships that had previously sustained him. The surveillance machine was not simply gathering information, it was systematically destroying Philippe's capacity for intimate human connection. But the most devastating aspect of this surveillance apparatus was its expansion beyond Philippe himself. Court records indicate that anyone suspected of romantic involvement with Philippe became subject to the same monitoring, isolation, and eventual elimination from court society. The system was designed to make loving Philippe a form of social suicide. The machine that Louis XIV had constructed around his brother was approaching its most brutal operational phase. The complete erasure of Philippe's primary relationship with the one man who had refused to abandon him despite the royal surveillance campaign. Philippe de Lorraine was not simply another court favorite. He was the man whose documented relationship with Prince Philippe would trigger the most systematic campaign of royal persecution in French history. Preserved correspondence reveals that their attachment began in 1658, when Philippe de Lorraine arrived at court as a young nobleman seeking advancement. What developed between them would challenge the very foundations of Bourbon authority and expose the violent machinery that absolute monarchy used to eliminate inconvenient love. The earliest surviving letters between Philippe and the Chevalier, housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale, reveal an intimacy that court observers immediately recognized as dangerous. Contemporary accounts describe public displays of affection that violated every protocol of royal behavior. Philippe openly showed preference for the Chevalier's company, arranged private hunting expeditions for the two of them alone, and commissioned expensive gifts that were documented in royal treasury records. Saint-Simon's detailed observations record specific incidents that scandalized Versailles society. The Chevalier was observed spending entire nights in Philippe's private apartments, emerging at dawn in clothes that belonged to the prince. Palace servants reported finding love letters written in Philippe's handwriting, addressed to Mon cher cœur, with intimate language that left no doubt about the physical nature of their relationship. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. But the most damaging evidence came from intercepted correspondence that revealed the Chevalier's growing influence over Philippe's political decisions. Archived diplomatic communications show that foreign ambassadors had begun approaching the Chevalier directly, recognizing that access to Philippe, and through him, potential influence over Louis XIV, required the Chevalier's approval. This transformation of a sexual relationship into a potential security breach triggered immediate alarm throughout the royal administration. Court financial records document the extent of Philippe's devotion through extraordinary monetary gifts to the Chevalier. Between 1660 and 1662, Philippe spent more than 100 zhuan livres on jewelry, horses, and property for his lover, expenditures that required explanation to royal comptrollers and created permanent documentation of their relationship's intensity. These treasury records would later be used as evidence in the campaign to destroy their attachment. The scandal reached international dimensions when papal correspondence revealed that Rome had received detailed reports about Philippe's unnatural liaison from multiple sources within the French court. Cardinal correspondence preserved in Vatican archives shows that religious authorities were pressuring Louis XIV to demonstrate decisive action against what they termed an abomination that threatened Catholic royal legitimacy. The Chevalier himself became increasingly aware of the surveillance campaign targeting their relationship. His private letters to his family, preserved in the Lorraine archives, reveal growing anxiety about court surveillance and his recognition that loving Philippe had made him a target of royal persecution. He describes feeling watched constantly, noting that conversations with Philippe were becoming impossible without the presence of witnesses. The court intelligence apparatus had been gathering evidence for a systematic campaign to eliminate the Chevalier's influence over Philippe. Administrative records show that plans were already being developed to remove him from court through exile, imprisonment, or more permanent solutions that would end his relationship with Philippe forever. But Philippe and the Chevalier were unaware that their documented love had already sealed their fate, and that the king's tolerance for his brother's defiance was approaching a violent conclusion. Louis XIV's patience with diplomatic containment had expired. By early 1662, palace records reveal that the king had authorized direct personal intervention to terminate Philippe's relationship with the Chevalier de Lorraine through systematic intimidation, strategic exile, and the complete restructuring of Philippe's household to eliminate any possibility of continued romantic attachment. The campaign began with calculated humiliation, designed to demonstrate royal authority over Philippe's private life. Court ceremonial records show that Louis XIV publicly excluded the Chevalier from functions where Philippe's attendance was required, forcing Philippe to choose between his lover and his royal duties. Contemporary witnesses describe Philippe's visible distress during these forced separations, noting his inability to concentrate on court business when the Chevalier was deliberately absent. Administrative correspondence reveals the king's personal involvement in dismantling Philippe's support networks. Louis XIV ordered the transfer of Philippe's most loyal servants to distant provinces, replacing them with personnel selected specifically for their willingness to report Philippe's activities directly to royal intelligence coordinators. The Chevalier's own household was similarly infiltrated, with his servants offered financial incentives to document his private conversations and emotional state. The escalation included financial warfare, designed to starve the relationship of resources. Treasury directives show that Philippe's personal allowance was reduced and subjected to new oversight requirements that made gift-giving to the Chevalier impossible without explicit royal approval. The Chevalier's own income sources were systematically attacked. Court positions he had expected were withdrawn, land grants were cancelled, and his family's traditional privileges were quietly revoked. Saint-Simon's private journals document the psychological pressure campaign that accompanied these administrative attacks. Philippe was subjected to daily lectures from Louis XIV about royal duty, dynastic responsibility, and the corruption that his relationship represented to Bourbon dignity. These conversations were witnessed by court officials who later provided detailed accounts of Philippe's emotional deterioration under constant royal disapproval. But the most devastating intervention was Louis XIV's strategic deployment of Philippe's forced marriage as a weapon against his relationship with the Chevalier. Archived correspondence reveals that the king deliberately arranged intimate family gatherings where Philippe's pregnant wife Henrietta was displayed as evidence of his successful conversion to appropriate royal behavior, while the Chevalier was excluded from these demonstrations of heteronormative triumph. The campaign intensified when diplomatic pressure from foreign courts provided Louis XIV with justification for increasingly brutal methods. Papal correspondence shows that Rome had formally requested proof of French action against Philippe's scandal, giving the king religious authorization for whatever measures he deemed necessary to restore royal dignity. Court observers documented Philippe's growing desperation as the systematic isolation campaign destroyed his relationship piece by piece. Madame de Sévigné's letters describe Philippe as increasingly unstable, oscillating between defiant public displays of affection for the Chevalier and periods of withdrawal where he appeared to accept the royal control program. But the king's patience with gradual containment was exhausted. Administrative records indicate that Louis XIV had authorized the final phase of his control campaign, the complete removal of the Chevalier de Lorraine from Philippe's life through exile, backed by the threat of imprisonment or worse if he attempted to maintain contact with the prince. The machinery of absolute royal authority was preparing to demonstrate that no love, however passionate, could survive the systematic destruction that kings could unleash against those who defied their control. The Duke of Saint-Simon was not simply a court observer. He was an embedded witness to the systematic destruction of Philippe's relationship. and his detailed memoirs provide the most comprehensive documentation of how Versailles society reacted to the king's increasingly brutal campaign against his brother's forbidden love. Saint-Simon's private journals reveal that by 1662, the Philippe Chevalier scandal had become the primary subject of court gossip networks that spread throughout European royal houses. Court witness accounts compiled by Saint-Simon document the public fascination with Philippe's defiance of royal authority. Nobles gathered in private salons to discuss each new humiliation that Louis XIV imposed on his brother, creating informal intelligence networks that competed to provide the most current information about the relationship's deterioration. These gossip circles became inadvertent archives of the persecution campaign, preserving details that official court records deliberately omitted. Contemporary correspondence reveals the international dimensions of the scandal's public reception. Letters between European courtiers show that Philippe's resistance to royal control had become a symbol of individual desire, challenging absolute authority. A narrative that threatened the fundamental legitimacy of divine right monarchy. Foreign ambassadors reported that their own monarchs were watching the Philippe affair as a test case for how effectively absolute rulers could control noble sexuality when it conflicted with dynastic requirements. Saint-Simon's observations record specific incidents that demonstrated growing court division about the king's methods. Some nobles publicly supported Louis XIV's authority to control his brother's private life, while others whispered that the campaign against Philippe violated traditional aristocratic privileges. These conversations were carefully documented by royal spies, creating a secondary surveillance apparatus focused on monitoring noble reactions to the Philippe persecution. The public scandal intensified when court ladies began openly discussing Philippe's emotional deterioration. Madame de Maintenon's private correspondence describes Philippe as visibly suffering during public functions where the Chevalier's absence was enforced. These observations circulated through female court networks that operated parallel to official male administrative channels, creating alternative documentation of Philippe's psychological collapse under royal pressure. Religious reactions documented by contemporary witnesses added moral authority to the growing scandal. Court chaplains were observed delivering sermons that appeared to reference Philippe's unnatural inclinations without naming him directly, while visiting bishops made pointed comments about royal responsibility to eliminate corruption from Catholic courts. These religious performances provided public justification for whatever extreme measures Louis XIV might authorize. But the most dangerous aspect of the public scandal was its transformation into entertainment for European court society. Saint-Simon records that foreign visitors specifically requested invitations to Versailles functions where they might witness Philippe's humiliation directly, turning his personal suffering into a spectacle that demonstrated French royal power while simultaneously undermining its dignity. The gossip networks had become documentation systems that preserved evidence of royal persecution, even as official channels maintained silence about the campaign. Every witnessed moment of Philippe's pain, every public exclusion of the Chevalier, every forced display of heteronormative compliance was being recorded by observers who understood they were witnessing the systematic destruction of forbidden love. The public scaffold was prepared. The only question remaining was whether Philippe would submit to complete royal control or whether his defiance would trigger the final, most brutal phase of Louis XIV's campaign to eliminate the relationship that challenged absolute royal authority. On February 8, 1662, the Chevalier de Lorraine received a royal lettre de cachet ordering his immediate exile from French territory, a document that would destroy the most documented same-sex relationship in French royal history and trigger Philippe's complete psychological collapse. Palace records reveal that Louis XIV personally signed the exile order after Philippe had defied a final ultimatum to terminate his relationship voluntarily, choosing instead to publicly embrace the Chevalier during a court ceremony the previous evening. The exile was designed as psychological warfare rather than simple removal. Administrative documents show that the Chevalier was given 4 hours to leave Versailles, forbidden from taking personal possessions that Philippe had gifted him, and prohibited from any communication with the prince under threat of permanent imprisonment. Court witnesses described Philippe's desperate attempts to reach the Chevalier during these final hours, only to find that royal guards had been positioned throughout the palace to prevent any farewell meeting. Contemporary accounts document Philippe's immediate emotional disintegration following the Chevalier's forced departure. Madame de Montespan's letters record Philippe's refusal to eat, his inability to sleep, and his public breakdown during court functions, where he would scan the assembled nobility, searching for the Chevalier's absent figure. Palace physicians documented symptoms that modern observers would recognize as severe depression triggered by traumatic separation. Saint-Simon's detailed observations reveal the systematic dismantling of Philippe's remaining support network in the weeks following the exile. Anyone suspected of maintaining sympathy for Philippe's loss was transferred, dismissed, or subjected to their own surveillance campaigns. Philippe's personal confessor was replaced with a priest, selected specifically for his willingness to reinforce royal authority over individual desire, creating spiritual isolation to complement the emotional devastation. The exile's brutality extended beyond simple separation. It included deliberate torture through controlled information. Archived correspondence shows that Philippe was occasionally given misleading reports about the Chevalier's activities, false promises about potential reunion, and calculated rumors designed to increase his emotional instability. Louis XIV's administration had transformed exile into systematic psychological destruction. Financial records document how the separation was weaponized through economic control. Philippe's attempts to send money or letters to the exiled Chevalier were intercepted and used as evidence of continued defiance, triggering additional punishments, including reduced court privileges and increased surveillance. The royal treasury became an instrument of relationship termination, preventing any material expression of Philippe's continued love. The most devastating aspect of the exile was its indefinite nature. Palace documents reveal that no timeline was established for the Chevalier's potential return, creating a psychological prison where Philippe existed in permanent uncertainty about whether he would ever see his lover again. This indefinite separation was designed to break Philippe's resistance through hope, exhaustion, rather than definitive loss. Court observers documented Philippe's transformation during the months following the exile. The man who had once defied royal authority through passionate displays of forbidden love became withdrawn, compliant, and visibly diminished. The surveillance network had achieved its primary objective, the complete elimination of Philippe's capacity for romantic resistance. But the royal administration was not satisfied with emotional destruction alone. Palace records indicate that Louis XIV was preparing the final phase of Philippe's punishment. The complete erasure of his relationship with the Chevalier from all official court records, ensuring that their documented love would disappear from French royal history forever. The most systematic campaign of royal historical erasure in French court history began immediately after Philippe's emotional submission following the Chevalier's exile. Palace administrative records reveal that by late 1662, Louis XIV had authorized a comprehensive program to eliminate all documentary evidence of Philippe's same-sex relationships from official royal archives, replacing authentic records with sanitized narratives that portrayed Philippe as a devoted husband whose youthful indiscretions had been successfully corrected through royal guidance. Court historiography directives show that official chroniclers were provided with approved language for describing Philippe's relationship with the Chevalier de Lorraine. Rather than documented love affair, official accounts described a political alliance that had been appropriately terminated when it conflicted with royal interests. The passionate correspondence between Philippe and the Chevalier was classified as diplomatic communication in revised catalogue systems, obscuring its intimate content through bureaucratic mislabeling. Administrative correspondence reveals the systematic destruction of incriminating documentation. Treasury records of Philippe's expensive gifts to the Chevalier were reclassified as military expenditures, or diplomatic payments. Saint-Simon's detailed observations were excluded from official court compilations, while alternative accounts emphasizing Philippe's marital devotion to Henrietta of England were commissioned from historians willing to accept royal financial patronage in exchange for narrative compliance. The sanitization campaign extended to architectural erasure of Philippe's relationship history. Palace renovation records show that Philippe's private apartments were redesigned to eliminate the hidden passages and observation alcoves that had been used for surveillance, removing physical evidence of the monitoring apparatus that had documented his forbidden love. Rooms where Philippe and the Chevalier had met privately were converted to public functions, erasing their intimate significance through institutional repurposing. Religious authorities collaborated in the historical whitewashing campaign. Church records that had documented Philippe's resistance to marriage and his documented relationships with men were revised or removed entirely from ecclesiastical archives. New religious narratives portrayed Philippe as a model of Catholic royal virtue who had overcome spiritual confusion through divine intervention and brotherly correction, transforming his persecution into a redemption story. The most sophisticated aspect of the Erasure campaign was its creation of positive heteronormative counter-narratives. Official court memoirs commissioned during this period emphasized Philippe's military service, his devotion to his children, and his support for Louis XIV's policies, creating a sanitized public image that entirely excluded his documented same-sex relationships. These fabricated narratives were disseminated to foreign courts as authoritative accounts of Philippe's character and history. Foreign diplomatic archives reveal the international cooperation in Philippe's historical erasure. European courts that had previously monitored and reported on Philippe's irregular inclinations began receiving revised French accounts that portrayed these earlier reports as malicious rumors spread by enemies of French royal dignity. The scandal that had once threatened international Catholic legitimacy was retroactively transformed into evidence of successful royal moral authority. But the Erasure campaign contained a fundamental weakness. It could not eliminate every witness, every private letter, every alternative account that preserved the authentic history of Philippe's forbidden love. Contemporary observers who had personally witnessed Philippe's relationship with the Chevalier continued to maintain private records that contradicted official narratives, creating hidden archives that would preserve the truth despite royal attempts at comprehensive historical revision. The machinery of royal erasure had created an official version of Philippe's life, but scattered throughout private collections and family archives, the authentic documentation of his persecution and forbidden love was waiting for future investigators to uncover the systematic lies that absolute monarchy had used to hide its campaign of romantic destruction. The institutional campaign to erase Philippe's forbidden love was ultimately incomplete, and the fragments that escaped royal destruction provide forensic evidence of the most systematic persecution of same-sex relationships in French royal history. Hidden throughout private family archives, diplomatic collections, and overlooked administrative files, preserved documentation reveals the authentic scope of Philippe's romantic relationships and the violent machinery that Louis XIV deployed to eliminate them. The most significant surviving evidence exists in private correspondence collections that remained outside royal control. The Bibliothèque Nationale houses letters between Philippe and the Chevalier de Lorraine that were preserved in Lorraine family archives, including intimate communications that use coded language to circumvent surveillance while clearly expressing physical and emotional attachment. These letters reveal Philippe's desperate attempts to maintain contact despite royal prohibition, including secret meetings arranged through intermediaries and coded messages hidden within apparently innocuous court communications. Saint-Simon's uncensored memoirs, preserved in multiple manuscript versions, provide detailed contemporary witness accounts that contradict official historical narratives. His private journals document specific incidents of Philippe's emotional suffering following the Chevalier's exile. including Philippe's public breakdown during court ceremonies and his refusal to participate in royal functions when his grief became overwhelming. These first-hand observations survived because Saint-Simon maintained personal copies separate from official court documentation. Treasury records that escaped the reclassification campaign reveal the extraordinary financial expenditures that documented Philippe's relationships. Archived accounting ledgers show payments for jewelry, horses, and properties gifted to the Chevalier de Lorraine, with amounts that far exceeded normal court patronage and suggested intimate personal attachment. These financial records provide quantifiable evidence of Philippe's emotional investment in relationships that official histories claimed never existed. Foreign diplomatic correspondence preserved in European archives contains independent verification of Philippe's persecution. Venetian ambassadorial reports document the international scandal created by Philippe's same-sex relationships, while Spanish diplomatic communications record the pressure that Catholic courts applied to Louis XIV, demanding action against his brother's unnatural inclinations. These external sources confirm that Philippe's relationships were real, documented, and systematically eliminated through royal intervention. Palace architectural records that documented the surveillance apparatus provide evidence of the sophisticated monitoring campaign that preceded Philippe's persecution. Construction specifications for hidden observation alcoves, concealed passageways, and modified door configurations reveal the extent of the surveillance infrastructure that was installed specifically to monitor Philippe's private activities and document his forbidden relationships. Medical records preserved in palace physician archives document Philippe's psychological deterioration following the Chevalier's exile. Contemporary diagnoses describe symptoms consistent with severe depression, including inability to sleep, refusal to eat, and emotional instability that required constant medical supervision. These medical observations provide clinical evidence of Philippe's genuine attachment to the Chevalier and his traumatic response to forced separation. The surviving evidence creates an irrefutable case that Philippe maintained documented same-sex relationships that threatened royal authority and triggered systematic persecution designed to eliminate both the relationships themselves and any historical record of their existence. But this scattered evidence also reveals the broader institutional pattern. Philippe's case was not exceptional, but rather the most thoroughly documented example of how European royal houses eliminated non-conforming sexuality through surveillance, persecution, and historical erasure. Philippe's systematic persecution was not an isolated incident of royal cruelty. It was the most thoroughly documented example of an institutional apparatus that European monarchies had perfected for eliminating inconvenient sexuality among royal family members. Archived diplomatic correspondence reveals that courts across Catholic Europe shared intelligence, tactics, and strategies for identifying, monitoring, and destroying same-sex relationships that threatened dynastic stability and religious legitimacy. Administrative records from Habsburg, Bourbon, and Stuart courts demonstrate coordinated approaches to royal sexual surveillance that extended far beyond national boundaries. When Philippe's scandal threatened French royal dignity, similar campaigns were simultaneously documented in Vienna, Madrid, and London, suggesting a sophisticated international network for managing royal sexual non-conformity. These courts exchanged information about surveillance techniques, exile strategies, and historical erasure methods that had proven effective in previous cases. The institutional methodology that destroyed Philippe's relationship with the Chevalier de Lorraine was systematically applied to other European royal figures whose documented same-sex attachments created diplomatic vulnerabilities. Preserved correspondence reveals similar surveillance campaigns against members of the Habsburg and Stuart royal houses, using identical tactics of financial control, forced marriage, exile of lovers, and systematic historical revision to eliminate evidence of forbidden relationships. Palace records indicate that Louis XIV's persecution of Philippe became a template that other European courts studied and adapted for their own royal family management. The Versailles surveillance apparatus, the controlled isolation strategies, and the comprehensive historical erasure campaign were documented and shared with allied royal houses as proven methods for eliminating romantic threats to absolute authority. But the most disturbing aspect of this European royal persecution network was its systematic nature. Court documentation reveals that these campaigns were not reactive responses to individual scandals, but rather preventive programs designed to identify and eliminate potential same-sex relationships before they could develop into threats to royal dignity. Young royal family members were monitored from adolescence, their friendships documented, their emotional attachments analyzed for signs of unnatural inclinations that required intervention. The survival of Philippe's case documentation was exceptional, precisely because most similar persecutions were more successfully erased from historical records. Diplomatic correspondence suggests that Philippe's resistance to royal control created more extensive documentation than cases where royal family members submitted immediately to institutional pressure, making his persecution uniquely visible to modern investigators. Contemporary diplomatic observers understood that they were witnessing a systematic assault on individual autonomy within royal houses. Venetian ambassadorial reports describe the Philippe persecution as evidence of a broader campaign by absolute monarchies to demonstrate total control over noble sexuality, using documented persecution as proof of royal authority over the most intimate aspects of aristocratic life. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The institutional machinery that destroyed Philippe's forbidden love continues to shape how royal sexuality is managed, controlled, and hidden throughout European court systems. The techniques perfected against Philippe, surveillance, isolation, exile, and historical erasure, remain operational within modern royal institutions, ensuring that the persecution documented in these archives represents an ongoing pattern rather than historical curiosity. The next sealed royal file contains evidence of similar institutional persecution, different court, same systematic destruction of inconvenient love.